Your Eminence, dear Sayedna, Excellencies, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear students, today we have the great privilege and the unique opportunity to listen to a sincere testimony of an active witness to one of the most prolonged conflicts of the modern history. A conflict that is happening in the Middle East, but affecting European and global security. The rich history of Israel and Palestine transcends their geographic boundaries. This region for billions is undoubtedly the Holy Land, adding a religious layer to the conflict, but maybe also to the solution. Religion continues to be an integral part of society and a source of identity, especially in the Middle East. As an academic institution specializing in European affairs, the College of Europe in Natolin gained over the years a solid experience in European Neighbourhood Studies under the prism of several disciplines, one of which is definitely religion. In the past years, we hosted 2 conferences about the religion and European integration, and this year we launched the Religion and Politics Nest. The lecture of His Eminence is an important addition to this sequence. Moreover, what we are doing today is fulfilling Article 17 of the Lisbon Treaty, which laid the basis for an open, transparent, and regular dialogue with religious institutions. However, we are not receiving Cardinal Pizzaballa today exclusively as a religious representative. His Eminence is also a prominent intellectual who has a long-standing contribution to the human discourse on coexistence, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Sayedna, on your side, and upon your elevation to the dignity of cardinate, you made your vow to be the voice of Jerusalem, a voice needed today more than ever. On our side, our mission is to listen to voices of wisdom in a world divided by polarization, hatred, and war. So, Your Eminence, welcome to Natolin, where we advocate strongly for coexistence, forgiveness, and reconciliation, just like you. Thank you.
Thank you for this. First of all, I have to apologize. I have a little cold. In Jerusalem, we passed quite suddenly in the last days from 15 degrees to 40 degrees, and apparently I'm not that young as before. And thank you for this invitation. I want, first of all, a caveat. I'm not here to talk about the conflict of Gaza or to present analysis, my personal analysis about the political situation of the war and anyway the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and so on. I did it in the past. I'm not afraid of this, but this is not what I'm called to do. I was invited to talk about to talk as religious. I'm religious, more or less. I'm man of the church. I hope to be also man of God, one day, or man of faith, let's say. Okay. From how I see how to, and which attitude to have in this terrible situation. So I try to be as clear as possible. In times of war, generally speaking, and in abstract sense, everyone's mission, not only religious leaders, should be to work for peace. We all agree on this. But is it still possible to think peace in Holy Land today? Peace today seems to be a theoretical concept, a distant idea, utopian world void of content, if not an object of instrumentalization, as it is sometimes, often. Often the same people who advocate for peace in their speeches by saying, they end their speeches by saying that war is unavoidable in order to achieve peace in the Holy Land. Is it even possible to speak today of Holy Land? It's not a puzzling oxymoron, a contradiction in terminis, Holy Land. A wise Franciscan, my professor, Father Testa, said, used to repeat that Holy Land and holy water always make mud. So how do we get out of the mud of this war, out of this terrible swamp, which the more we go in, the more impossible it seems to get out? Since October 7, and like any inhabitant of the Holy Land, I've been in a sea of blood and fire. From October 7 to today, we have been caught up in a storm of events, experiencing death, destruction, wounds, violence, resentments, and a desire for revenge. Certainly, what has happened has made me more committed to the flock of which I am unworthily the shepherd, especially for the nature of the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, the church, which has jurisdiction over Israel and Palestine, the two conflicting parties. I have Catholics who are Israelis, Catholics who are Palestinians. I have some Palestinians, Catholics are under the bombs, and others are serving in the army, bombing. So, and these bring tensions also within our church community. An extremely complicated scene. Our land is still wounded and bleeding. Our people are scarred by terror, panic, and uncertainty about the future. Many are left with nothing but rubble. I think about Gaza now. The current crisis blocks any prospect for peace. It has quickly swept away years of interfaith dialogue, of painstakingly building relationships between communities, and arduous attempts to bring people together. Today, everyone is trapped in their own context, closed within their own community, stuck in their own pain, often angry, disappointed, and without confidence. It is therefore clear to everyone that a new beginning must be made with patience to correct the mistakes of the past, to heal the wounds that have not been properly healed. It is also clear that the time frame of this process will definitely be long and will require complex paths, but will nevertheless definitely be worthy. It will have to be acknowledged that the words justice, truth, reconciliation, forgiveness that you mentioned right now cannot be just wishful thinking, as perhaps they have been until now, at least as they are perceived in Holy Land, but must find tangible context with a common interpretation and become credible and desired expression again, without which it is difficult to imagine a different future. To have a common interpretation is not granted. When you say forgiveness or you say reconciliation, everyone thinks different concepts. It's not exactly the same. We must believe that despite everything, it's still possible to have a different future than the one promised by war and violence. This is our belief. It must be said that there is an ongoing debate and different interpretation of the events. For some, the novelty lies only in the intensity of the events since October 7th, but not in their dynamics, which have instead been the same since 1948. For others, however, October 7 is absolutely new. And that shows how huge is the differences between the parties. And then when you are there and you talk about the news of 7 October, Palestinians get angry. and vice versa. So, I'm talking about everyday experiences we are living there. In any case, the media and our cell phones since October 7 are full of images of blood, destruction, and death, but also of revenge and resentment. This is perhaps one of the biggest difficulties of our time, at least in Holy Land. One's own heart is so full, flooded, and torn by pain that there is no room for the pain of the others. Everyone sees themselves as the victim, the only victim of this whole tsunami of hatred that has thrown over us. Everyone wants empathy only for their own situation. Everyone feels betrayed if you express understanding for others. A situation that is hurtful in every way. It would be better sometimes to remain silent and not say anything, and someone is doing this. But I think it's also, despite everything, even if it is complicated, it's necessary to raise our voice and to talk. So allow me to present from my religious perspective 5 attitudes in this we should have, as I see it, as a religious leader. First of all, prophetic approach. I'll try to explain what I mean. As any religious, I generally need to find my inspiration in the scripture. In times of war, the prophetic approach for a religious leader is the greatest inspiration. When I don't know what to say and how to behave, I go to the scripture and the examples of prophets and so on. I don't mean here, prophetic doesn't mean to see the future, to predict the future. I mean having a clear vision, being able to orient and taking the freest possible look at life, disregarding how hard it seems. If religious leaders lose this approach, they are simply attempting to please, saying what people want to hear, which is a recurrent risk, especially in the Middle East, the risk of going with the flow rather than direct it. Prophets, on the contrary, have always redirected people's expectations. When things are calm and serene, and everyone is stable in their comfort zones, the prophet shakes this conviction and draws new paths. And when people are in exile, hopeless, and their cities are ruined, the prophet strangely still reorients them. He gives them consolation, comfort, and hope. Of course, it is difficult for the prophet who is internally torn. As a man of God, he must proclaim his word, the word of God. As a man among his fellows, he endures the same misery, witnessing blood and destruction. The life of the prophet always contains a dramatic element, belonging entirely to God, entirely to the people, called to be the one out-of-tune voice in the choir, a voice of threat and consolation, which from one side hurts and on the other consoles. I consider the book of Lamentations, I don't know if you read it, but it would be interesting to read it, at least part of it. Sometimes it looks quite depressing, but because it's the saddest and most heartbreaking book of the Bible. And it is a collection of poems expressing the grief of Jewish people after the full destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in the 6th century before Christ. Even in this very sad book, full of grief and loss, you may find an astonishing call for hope. At its heart, exactly at the midst of the third lament out of 5, the term tov, good, is repeated 3 times. I quote, "The Lord is good to those who wait for him. To the soul who seeks him, it is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the burden of his youth." Therefore, in the current tragedy, we must return to the heart of this book, to what is tov, to what is good, to hope. Giving hope is not a simple act of kindness, which is also important, but when people are desperate, They think that they will not be able to rebuild. They are convinced that they will not rise from the rubble, just as sometimes happens to us in an individual or collective tragedy. And this is what we are living now. No one right now is believing that it's possible to rebuild Gaza. No one believes that it's possible to rebuild perspective for the future. There are no perspective. This war cancelled, cancel any hope of a different future for the Holy Land. Giving hope is actually a call to reconstruction. Today we are in a tragedy, not only in the Holy Land, but also in many places of the world and in the Church also. In this sense, a great mission awaits us all. And for this reason, I hope you are all here in this beautiful college, as I saw, to teach and to learn how to rebuild this faltering world, how to heal this wounded humanity, how to rebuild in beauty, in harmony, as builder of peace, artisans of peace, to use an expression of Pope Francis. Therefore, in this context of great perplexity, everyone, for their part, is called to be a prophet. I mean, to give courage and to build life prospects. In concrete terms, it means that not only in the religious term, but also in politics, economics, culture, we may be prophets by having the conviction that one must do everything possible to exit the dark tunnel, to support positive and enlightened thinking, critical thinking, to avoid manipulation, and indeed to promote encounter and dialogue. So the first attitude is prophetic approach. I mean, to think different, as someone said in the past, but also to be able to give perspective, to help to think, to help also to the people to think different, not to follow the flow, but to direct it. The second is overcoming trauma and healing wounds. I would like to draw your attention to an article, I don't want to remain just on Holy Scripture, by Jessica Stern and Bessel van der Volk, that appeared in Foreign Affairs on December 7th, last December 7th. The title was The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict and the Psychology of Trauma. What we are living now is a big trauma. The first is an American academic and expert on terrorism. The second is an American psychiatrist and researcher, an expert in the field of post-traumatic stress. I quote except from her article. I quote, "Is it possible to abandon the impulse to punish indiscriminately? Is it possible to overcome the human urge to retaliate? To achieve this, leaders must reach out to divided communities and give them hope in a seemingly hopeless time. It is necessary to understand that the legacy of trauma leaves Israeli Jews and Palestinians vulnerable to reactive violence, leading to a seemingly endless cycle of bloodshed." I continue. "To break the intergenerational cycle of trauma, it is necessary to stop the violence and develop empathy for those who have suffered the trauma. Whatever the next step will be, it is important to keep in mind that hate can be tremendously activating after an injury. Grief, reciprocity, and reconciliation are extremely complex and a laborious process, but they are the only hope of interrupting the transmission of violence between generations." End of quotations. Thus, this study suggests a possible way forward for our Holy Land: reciprocity and reconciliation. Wounds cannot simply be erased or ignored with a peace that simply means the absence of war. The agreement, the international agreement, the Oslo agreement, whatever will be the agreement of the future, will not erase, will not prepare the society for peace if these wounds are not healed. There are wounds that will forever remain engraved in our bodies and memories. They cannot be removed because they are scarce. In order to look to the future with hope and peace, it is necessary not to forget. I mean, not to wait for the problem to resolve itself, but to embark on a path of purification of memory. More precisely, of remembering the evil committed and or suffered, revising its interpretation in the light of current awareness, taking it upon oneself, and then overcoming it. This is a very long and laborious process. It requires a determined will, a positive action of confronting evil, without stagnating at the evil suffered and or committed. What is important to say is that if the wounds are not healed, accepted, processed, and shared, they will continue to cause pain for years or even centuries to come. The difficult relations between Jews and Christians, Muslims and Christians, and so on, the difficulty of today are connected with the wounds of the past. If there is no purification and rereading of our past in a different way, these wounds will continue to be a filter according to which we see and relate to one another. In fact, if the wounds are not processed, as I said, they create an attitude of victimhood, and anger that makes reconciliation difficult, if not impossible. A psychologist knows very well that each of us is called to become a wounded healer. We are all wounded in our life, in our communities, and so on. But wound can also bring the action of healing. It is not enough to explore the cause of trauma, and in our case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The libraries, I suppose also your library, is full of the analysis of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One must take them up and transform them into an end so that the wounds can be transfigured in order to help others. We are not only called to explore the causes of our wounds, but rather to ensure that they are transfigured. Even our personal, social, and emotional wounds can be transformed into opportunities to better understand the wounds of others and into instruments to help them. The third attitude is a question of language, which is, I think, one of the most important in this war. Much has been said in recent months about the inhumanity of this war, as indeed all wars are. You can say also about Ukraine and many other places. Inhumanity in the acts carried out, which the images have clearly shown. Indeed, there were and there are images that leave one stunned by their cruelty and the pain they cause. And behind these images, which say more than millions of words, there are real, concrete, tangible stories. They are not reconstructions or fakes. What happened on October 7 in southern Israel and what is happening now in the Gaza Strip is a deep wound to human rights, values, and dignity. Our community in Gaza, our Christian community in Gaza, is trapped in our churches. I'm in contact with them, and on a daily basis I meet people, Palestinians and Israelis, who are affected by these situations, deeply hurt and humiliated. In these encounters, I feel that it's not enough to assure them that we are doing every possible thing to help them, to provide them with the necessary humanitarian aid, but also in need of words of closeness, compassion, and understanding. Because pain and hatred must be confronted with hope and light. Accordingly, you have to have the courage to speak. You must not only say what you think, but you have also to think what you say. And be aware that words carry a heavy weight, especially in such delicate situations. In particular, those who hold public offices, they have a duty to lead their respective communities with appropriate language that is capable of expressing feelings and common perception on the one hand, but also of guiding, as I said before, guiding thought, and limiting the drift of hatred and mistrust that often runs rampant in the media with easy, bearing words like arrows striking the heart. So we must not chase the tide, but know how to steer it, while also taking responsibility for misexpressing. Language creates perspectives, thoughts, and opinions, stirring up hope, but also hatred. Language can create the wrong word can create hate. So the use of the words is not secondary. Remaining human and respecting other dignity and rights begins with language. Violent, aggressive language, laden with hatred and contempt, rejection and exclusion, is not a side issue in this war, but one of the main tools in these and any other wars. Calling the other animal, or using derogating terms that deny their humanity, is also a form of violence that can justify or even trigger violence in many other contexts and forms. Some words may harm more than bombs and massacres. God created the universe with the word, be the light, be the sun, and so on. With the word, he created the world, according to book of Genesis. We also create our universe with our words. We have seen this in a very tangible and hard way in these months. But if we look closely, we may have recognized it even earlier. How often, over the years, have we had to be careful, at least not in land, I don't know here, not to use certain words in one context that were common in another, and vice versa. Each side, Israeli and Palestinians, had and has its own vocabulary, its own narrative, different and independent of each other, sometimes also opposite each other. Each side, Haram al-Sharif and Temple Mount, just for you an example, the name of the cities, the name of the streets, the same street, different names according to, and we have to be careful to know with whom we are talking, not only with whom we are talking, also to know what he thinks about. We have to be always very careful. On the Israeli side, for example, the vocabulary revolved around the concept of security. On the Palestinian side, it is all about occupation and justice. You talk with Palestinians, the word occupation is in every sentence. The Israelis, the word security in every sentence, and they behind any decision, in any concept, and so on. To be clear, and not to be misunderstood, these words are sacrosanct, are important words, reflect reality and necessity. Security is important, and the occupation is real. And this word deserves respect. The problem is that these narratives are independent of each other and never really meet. And this has become explosively clear in recent months. So what we need at home, at work, worship places, universities, on our own social media is the courage to use non-exclusive language, which can create a new world, not yet visible, but clear on the horizons. So it's important to stress this. We create our world with our words. So our words should be word of inclusion. Maybe this word of inclusion, of reconciliation, is not really still present now, but opens horizons and create perspectives. This is what we need to know. Even if you are considered someone like the prophets, out of tune, out of the context. For me, is the ultimate and greatest contribution churches or any religious entity can bring in such a situation, namely to provide this language and to promote it. I always refused in this period because I was called to take a decision about 7 October. You have they expect you to say certain things, to use certain words. The same on the other side. I always refused. Sometimes I prefer not to answer or sometimes I'm blamed because I don't use the right expression, but it's important for me, first of all, to remain independent in my decision what to say or not to say. The second, to be always a different voice. That helps. Maybe you can be blamed, you can be a source of misunderstandings, but in a way independent and free. And language, which is, the balance is not simple, because now everyone wants you to be engaged in their own narrative, Israelis and Palestinians. We need to blame Hamas for what he did and stop that. And we have to talk about Gaza and only Gaza, what is going on in Gaza and so on. So to use a language where attached to the truth, at the same time able to keep channel of communication open is not that simple, but this is the only contribution the Church can give right now. The fourth aspect is something that could be strange for you, because this conflict is also spiritual conflict. I don't know how much the spiritual conflict can be. This is European College and Europe with spirituality. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, you ask a religious leader to talk, so I try to be also somewhat religious also in my approach.